Today we're diving into the story of how one of the ancient world's great cities fell. But this isn't a story about a foreign conqueror. It's about how Jerusalem was brought to ruin by the enemy that was already inside its walls. So it really begs the question, right? How does a massive, fortified city, one that seems totally impenetrable, actually fall? Do you just need a bigger army at the gates? Well, the historical accounts from this time give us a pretty chilling answer. For Jerusalem, the fatal breach wasn't made in its stone walls. It was in the people themselves. The city's destruction was, for the most part, a completely self-inflicted wound. Okay, so let's set the scene. Our story really kicks off as the Roman army is steamrolling through Galilee. Radical rebels, who we know as the Zealots, they flee the fighting and head straight for Jerusalem. And they bring thousands of refugees with them. But, instead of being reinforcements, they just bring chaos, and they completely shatter the city's already fragile order. And what's their first move? They seize the most sacred site in the entire city, the temple. One historian at the time called it their personal shop of tyranny. And from this holy ground, they launch a violent, bloody power struggle against Jerusalem's own leadership. And this power struggle, it gets out of hand fast. The Zealots, who are now holed up in the temple and besieged by the city's own leaders, they realize they need an edge. And they find it, not with weapons, but with a devastating lie that's going to bring the whole government crashing down. The whole deception was brilliantly methodical. First, a zealot leader named John of Gischala starts a rumor that the high priest, a man named Ananus, is a traitor who's planning to surrender the city to Rome. It's a total lie, but it works. They use this lie to send a desperate letter to the neighboring Idumeans, begging them to come help maintain liberty. Well, the Idumeans believe they're riding in to be heroes, so they muster an army of 20,000 men and march on Jerusalem. Then, under the cover of a storm, the Zealots sneak out, open a gate, and just let this army right into the heart of the city. And the result? It's an absolute bloodbath. The Idumeans and Zealots just hunt down and slaughter anyone who opposes them. And their main target is the very man they lied about, High Priest Ananus, a figure who is described as the procurer of the city's preservation. His murder is a massive turning point. I mean, the historical account is crystal clear on this. The death of Ananus, the guy who was holding everything together, it wasn't just another casualty of war. It was the moment the city truly began to die. It was the absolute point of no return. But you'd think after all that, the Zealots would finally unite, right? Nope, not even close. Instead, their movement just splinters. Absolute power corrupts, and a new, even more chaotic chapter begins. A three-way civil war for control of a city that's already under siege. So now, Jerusalem isn't one city anymore. It's basically three competing tyrannies all crammed together. You've got Eleazar, who holds the inner part of the temple. Then there's John of Gischala. Yeah, the guy behind the big lie, he controls the outer temple. And then a third warlord, Simon Bar-Giora, he takes over the rest of the city. They've become kings of their own tiny, little, ruined kingdoms. And get this, all of this infighting is happening while the Roman legions are literally building siege ramps right outside the walls. But instead of, mounting a unified defense, these three factions spend all their time, all their resources, and all their men fighting each other. The war for Jerusalem had turned completely inward. But what happens next? Honestly, it's just mind-boggling in its stupidity. The factions escalate their war on each other, and in doing so, they commit the ultimate act of self-sabotage, one that will seal the city's fate for good. Just try to picture this contrast for a second. Outside the walls, you have the disciplined Roman army, methodically preparing for a long siege, fully expecting the city to hold out for months, maybe longer. And then inside the walls, you have the city's so-called defenders systematically destroying the one thing they need to survive that siege, their own food supply. It became this insane, vicious cycle of pure spite. John's men would raid Simon's part of the city and set fire to his storehouses full of grain. And then, in retaliation, Simon's men would do the exact same thing to John's supplies. They thought they were burning each other's resources, but what they were really burning belonged to everyone in the city. And the scale of this destruction is just staggering. The sources say they burned enough grain and provisions to feed the entire population for years. In just a matter of weeks, through their own infighting, they had successfully engineered a citywide famine. The tragic irony here was not lost on the historians of the time. One of them wrote that this was all done as if purposely to assist the Romans. I mean, in their crazy lust for power over each other, these faction leaders basically became Rome's single most effective weapon. So what did this all mean for the hundreds of thousands of regular people trapped in Jerusalem? Well, it meant their world collapsed into an absolute nightmare of tyranny and starvation, and this was long before a single Roman soldier ever set foot inside the city. The reality on the ground was just horrific. People were literally reduced to gnawing on the leather from their belts and shields. Armed gangs from the factions would just burst into people's homes searching for any scrap of food they could find. If you were rich, maybe you could bribe a guard and escape, but if you were poor, you were trapped. Basic human dignity just vanished. They forbade the burial of the dead. If you were caught trying to bury a family member, you were killed on the spot. And the search for food, it turned into a system of pure terror. If the Zealots even suspected you were hiding food, they would torture you in the most horrific ways, twisting your joints until you confessed where it was. And even if you gave them what little you had, they'd often kill you anyway. Having food and having no food could lead to the exact same brutal end. And there was no way out. The factions guarded every single gate. Any person, man, woman, or child, caught trying to escape the starvation was immediately executed as a traitor. They were trapped, caught between a famine on the inside and execution at the gates. So when the Romans finally did breach the walls, they didn't find a city of proud, defiant warriors. They found a hollow shell. They found a population already starved into submission, and a defense completely shattered by its own infighting. Jerusalem had already been conquered, but it was conquered by its own leaders. You know, the philosopher Seneca once said that a city divided against itself is already half taken. And in Jerusalem's case, that wasn't just a metaphor. The division, the hatred, the self-destruction, it all did more to guarantee the city's fall than the entire Roman army standing outside. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty sobering question. The tragedy of Jerusalem is this timeless warning, really. What happens when a righteous fight for freedom against some outside force just rots from the inside and becomes a lust for power? What happens when the fight against tyranny becomes a tyranny of its own?